Hi everyone, welcome back to Millennial Finance 101. I'm Patrick. Thank you guys for checking out my channel. Today we're doing microeconomics, and more specifically than microeconomics, we are going to be doing curve shifts. So I know you guys have had a lot of problems with supply and demand, and I'm going to show you the tried and tested way to get the answer right all the time. So today we're going to focus on the fundamental shifts of supply and demand. So if you guys are ready, let's get started. We've already done the single shift graphs. Now let's do the double shift graphs. These are best approached when you look at each individual aspect by itself. So don't try and tackle both of them at once. Do each shift individually, and then you'll be able to make your conclusion. So let's go read through number 3 again and see what we got. The price of gasoline falls and consumer incomes generally increase. In the market for bus rides, we should expect to see a curve or curve shift. So they're telling us the curve is actually shifting. Now, what happens to the supply curve and what happens to the demand curve? So it tells us first that gas goes down, and it tells us second that income goes up. Now, first we have to attribute each of these things to supply or demand. Which one is going to be supply? Which one's going to be demand? So the first one here, gasoline. Now, you might remember this from a previous video. Gasoline is an input. I even said teachers love using this as an example. Gasoline is an input, and transportation costs are inputs for suppliers, right? So this decrease in gasoline is going to affect supply. Good. Now, before we figure out whether or not this increases supply or decreases supply, let's just attribute income to demand. And we know this again because the I in Mr. stands for income. Good. So let's look at these individual changes and see whether or not it increases or decreases supply and demand. A decrease in gasoline, now let's try and think about this for a second. A decrease in gasoline is a decrease in the price of an input. If an input becomes cheaper, that means it becomes more profitable for suppliers to produce more. So what are they going to do? They're going to produce more. So a decrease in gasoline should result in an increase in supply. Does that make sense? It becomes more profitable because the inputs become cheaper, so suppliers are going to supply more. Now let's look at demand. An increase in income is, how does that affect demand? Well, if you have more money, are you going to buy more stuff or less stuff? You're obviously going to buy more stuff. So that's going to increase our demand. So now we already have our two conclusions, and all we have to do is graph. So we know here, as always, our standard X, demand curve is downward sloping. Supply curve is upward sloping. Now let's draw and see what happens. So we know our supply curve is going to increase. So let me actually draw with a different color. So we're going to call this first point E1, and then we're going to switch colors so you can see the difference. Our supply curve is going to increase, right? So we're going to draw a new line right here. And I'm going to label our new supply curve S1. Now we also know that our demand curve is going to increase. So an increase in demand is a shift right. So I'm going to call our new demand increase D1. Our only conclusion right now is that supply is going to increase and demand is going to increase. That is absolutely the right answer. But some teachers are not that nice, and they're going to ask you, how does this change price and quantity? So that is where they always get you. Let's draw our new equilibrium point right here. And we're going to label this E2. So we already know that our first equilibrium point pertained to a price, we'll call this $15, and a quantity, we'll call this 20 units, right? Now, our new equilibrium point pertains to what looks like the same price. We're not sure about that, but it definitely increases in quantity. Now, the only conclusion, I'm just going to give you the answer, the only conclusion we can make about price and quantity is that quantity will definitely increase. Why can we only say that about quantity and not price? Either way you spin the direction or magnitude of the shifts, it always will result in a bigger quantity. However, now let's say, for example, our supply curve didn't miraculously change the same magnitude as our demand curve. Instead of shifting here, let's say it shifted all the way out here. If we drew it like that, you can see by this point here that our price would have actually decreased. Conversely, if I would have shifted this graph so it was only a small change, our price would have actually increased. That is why we don't have a conclusive reason that price is going to change. So the correct answer for this one, quantity will increase, price remains unsure. So we've done a one double shift question. Let's do another one, because these are really where teachers love to shine and love to screw you over. So let's read this next question together and see if we can get the right answer. The first question here is saying, wages of bus drivers increase. At the same time, income of consumers generally increase. In the market for bus rides, we should expect to see curve shifts. So the key word here is we are factoring in bus rides. We are looking at bus rides. So what happens to the supply curve? What happens to the demand curve? So let's write this down. Again, let's just take it slowly, look at each of the individual changes first. So the first thing they say is that wages of bus drivers increase. So we have wages, and it's going to increase. The second thing they say here are that consumer incomes are also going to increase. Now, first we have to figure out which one applies to supply, which one applies to demand. If we look at our previous example, this should be pretty straightforward. Wages we can think as an input, right? If you are a bus driver, wages are definitely an input in the production of bus rides. So anything that's going to be an input, if we remember refit, is going to relate to supply. Income, again, it's going to be something that relates to demand. We can see it right here. So we know that's going to be demand. Great. Now, let's try and figure out whether each of these changes are going to be an increase or a decrease. So it tells us here that wages are going to increase. If you are a bus company and the wages of your drivers increase, it is going to be less profitable for you. So if it's less profitable for you, are you going to supply more bus rides or less? The reality is you are going to supply less bus rides. Now, this is why wage increases are so controversial. In theory, they're a great idea for people who work, but the reason why it's always so opposed is because businesses will always supply less if wages increase. That is the big macroeconomic issue that we're all facing today. But I digress. So the next thing we talk about is demand. It tells us income increases. Now, what are we demanding? That is the big question. We are demanding bus rides. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and this is why I saved this question for here. If your income increases, are you going to ride the bus more, or are you going to ride the bus less? So this is where it gets tricky. The first thing you should have recognized are that bus rides are going to be an inferior good. You would rather drive, but since you don't have enough money, you're going to take the bus. But when your income increases, what happens to inferior goods? You buy less of them, right? So if we already established that the bus is an inferior good, so if our income increases, our demand for buses is also going to decrease because inferior goods move the opposite. Makes sense? So now let's graph, and we can see if we can make any conclusions about price and quantity. So So we already have we already draw our normal x, and we have our first equilibrium point right here. Now let's draw our new graph. So it tells us that supply is decreasing. If supply is decreasing, we are moving our graph to the left. So change the color. The graph moves to the left. If income increases, our demand for bus rides is also going to decrease. So this is also going to move to the left. And our new equilibrium point is right here. We'll call this E2. Now, what conclusions can we make about price and quantity? Let's think about the same example we had from before. We know for a fact that our quantity here, we'll create a number, let's say is 20, has 100% decrease. Regardless of the magnitude of these shifts, it will be less as a result. So let's say it's going to be 12. The same issue we had from before, where the price is indeterminate, also appears in this example. So depending on the magnitude, the price can be above or below. So our real answer for this one is that quantity will definitely decrease, but price, it's not determined. You cannot figure that one out based on the numbers that you have. All right, you guys, we have one more problem for supply and demand now, and you'll see this is going to be the math-related part of your econ course. So the questions are always going to ask you about the optimal or the market, price, and quantity. And now what does that mean? Anytime you see market price, market quantity, optimal, any of those keywords, they're basically asking us where supply equals demand, right? So where supply equals demand. Oftentimes your teacher is going to give you an equation. So we'll look through this example and we'll figure it out. So let's look at this example right now. So it tells us here that the demand and supply curve for computers are D equals 100 minus 6p. So D equals 100 minus 6p, and S equals 28 plus 3p. Make sense? Now it's pretty straightforward. To find what the market price and quantity is, all you have to do is set them equal to each other. So if we have 100 minus 6p equals 28 plus 3p, we just have to combine like terms. So we'll bring the p over to this side, and we're left with 9p. We added the 6p to the 3p, and then we're going to subtract 28 from this side, and we'll be left with 72. To solve for p, we'll divide both sides by 9, and we're going to get p equals 8. Pretty simple, right? Now, that's price. How do we figure out quantity? Well, pretty simple. We take this value of 8 and we plug it into either one of these equations. Now, it doesn't really matter which one it is because they'll both be equal. Regardless of where you plug it in, you'll get the same number. Or S, we'll say, equals 28 plus 24. S is going to equal 52. So, why did I say S? Because that's what the supply equals when P equals 8, but that is going to be the exact same thing as our quantity. So our coordinate for this one, P comma Q, is going to equal 8 comma 52. And then that's how we'll graph it at our equilibrium point. Everyone make sense? Good. You guys, thank you so much for checking out my video. Please like and subscribe, and if you have anything you want to see, leave it in the comment below.